The music stopped the moment Alina Whitmore pushed open the door of the private study, and what she saw inside made her chest go cold. Julian Ashford, her fiancé of 2 years, stood with his arms wrapped around her cousin Clara, his lips pressed to her hair, the two of them laughing softly as if the world belonged only to them. For a moment Alina could not move. She could only stare, her cream silk gown catching the candlelight, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the whole house could hear it. Julian turned first. His face drained of color, and Clara stepped back so quickly she knocked over a glass of wine, the red liquid spreading across the pale carpet like a wound. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, until Alina finally found her voice. "How long?" she asked, her tone flat, almost calm, though her hands were trembling at her sides. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. Clara looked away, unable to meet her cousin's eyes. "Alina, it isn't what it looks like," Julian finally said, taking a step toward her. "Don't," Alina said, raising a hand. "Don't you dare tell me what I did not just see with my own eyes." Outside the study door, the sound of the engagement party continued, oblivious to the storm breaking inside. String music drifted through the halls of the Whitmore estate, glasses clinked, and laughter rose and fell like waves. Alina had spent months planning this night. She had chosen the flowers herself, approved every dish on the menu, and picked out the very gown she now stood in, imagining it would be remembered as the happiest night of her life. Instead, it was becoming the night that shattered everything she believed about the man she was supposed to marry. "How long, Julian?" she asked again, her voice sharper this time. He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. "6 months," Clara whispered, finally looking up. Her eyes were wet, but Alina felt no pity for her, only a cold fury rising in her chest. 6 months. That meant the affair had begun not long after Julian proposed. It meant every kiss, every promise, every quiet evening they had spent planning their future together had been built on a lie. Alina's mind raced back through the memories now poisoned by the truth. The late nights Julian claimed were spent at his office. The sudden business trips that always seemed to align with Clara's visits to the city. The way Clara had grown distant over the past few months, barely meeting Alina's eyes during family dinners. She had noticed the signs and dismissed them, too trusting, too in love, too foolish to imagine that the two people she trusted most could betray her together. "You were supposed to be my family," Alina said, turning to Clara. Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the pain beneath her composure. "We grew up together. I trusted you with everything." Clara said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would undo what had been done. Julian reached for Alina's hand, but she pulled away before he could touch her. "Alina, please, let me explain. It meant nothing. You know how much I love you." "Love?" Alina let out a bitter laugh that startled even herself. "You do not know what that word means, Julian. A man who loves someone does not share his bed with her cousin for 6 months while planning a wedding with her." The door behind her creaked, and Alina turned to see several guests standing in the hallway, drawn by the raised voices. Among them was her Aunt Margaret, Clara's mother, her face pale with shock. Word would spread through the party within minutes, she knew. By morning, the entire city would know that Alina Whitmore had been humiliated in her own home, betrayed by the two people closest to her, on the very night meant to celebrate her future. She could have stayed and demanded answers. She could have caused a scene worthy of gossip for years to come. Instead, Alina did the only thing her pride would allow. She lifted her chin, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked past the gathering crowd with as much dignity as she could summon, though inside she felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet. "Alina, wait," Julian called after her, but she did not stop. She did not look back. She walked through the ballroom, past the orchestra that had just begun a new song, past the tables laden with food she would never taste, past the guests who turned to watch her pass with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She kept walking until she reached the front doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the cool night air. The garden outside the estate was quiet, lit only by lanterns strung between the trees. Alina walked until she reached the old stone fountain at the center of the grounds, the same fountain where Julian had proposed to her a year earlier, kneeling in the moonlight with a ring that had once seemed to promise forever. She sat on its edge now, staring at her own reflection in the rippling water, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of what had happened. Tears came, hot and sudden, but she wiped them away almost as quickly as they fell. She would not let this break her. She had spent her entire life building a reputation as a woman of strength, someone who ran her family's shipping business with the same sharp mind as her late father, someone who did not crumble under pressure. She refused to let Julian Ashford and her own cousin take that from her too. Footsteps approached from behind, and Alina turned, expecting Julian again, ready to tell him to leave her be. Instead, she found her father's old friend and family lawyer, a kind older man named Edmund Price, standing a respectful distance away. "I saw what happened," Edmund said gently. "I am so sorry, Alina." "Everyone will know by morning," Alina said, her voice hollow. "The Whitmore heiress, jilted before her own wedding, betrayed by her own blood." "Let them talk," Edmund said. "You have never cared what people say about you, and you should not start now." Alina managed a faint, humorless smile. That was easier to believe before tonight. Edmund sat beside her on the edge of the fountain. "Your father built this family's name on strength, not on the approval of gossiping strangers. You carry that same strength, whether you feel it tonight or not." Alina said nothing for a long moment, watching the water ripple in the lantern light. Somewhere behind them, the party continued, though the music now sounded distant and hollow, as if it belonged to another life entirely. "I gave him everything," she finally said. "My trust, my time, my future, and he could not even give me honesty in return." "Some people do not deserve what is given to them," Edmund said. "That is not a reflection of your worth, Alina. It is a reflection of his." She appreciated his words, but they did little to ease the storm inside her. Alina stood, brushing off her gown, and looked back toward the house where golden light spilled from every window. Somewhere in there, Julian was likely trying to explain himself to her family, to salvage what he could of his reputation and his engagement to the wealthiest young woman in the city. She would not give him the chance. "I need to leave," she said. "I cannot stay in that house tonight." "Where will you go?" Edmund asked, concern creasing his brow. Alina thought for a moment. She did not want to go to another family member's house, where she would be forced to endure sympathetic looks and endless questions. She did not want to return to her own home, where every room held reminders of Julian and the future they had planned together. She wanted somewhere far from all of it, somewhere no one would recognize her name or know her story. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I need air. I need to think." Edmund did not try to stop her, though worry remained etched on his face. "Take my carriage, at least. Do not walk the streets alone at this hour." Alina nodded her thanks and made her way around the side of the estate, avoiding the main entrance where guests still lingered, whispering behind gloved hands. She found Edmund's carriage waiting near the servant's gate and climbed inside without a word to the driver beyond a request to simply drive, anywhere, away from the house. As the carriage rolled through the quiet streets of the city, Alina stared out the window at the passing lamplights, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She thought of the years she had spent building her life around Julian, the wedding dress fittings, the plans for a home they would share, the quiet dreams of a family. All of it now felt like sand slipping through her fingers, impossible to hold onto no matter how tightly she tried. She thought, too, of Clara, the girl she had shared secrets with as children, the cousin she had defended countless times against their family's sharper tongues. That betrayal cut in a different way than Julian's, deeper somehow, because it came from someone who was supposed to be bound to her by more than promises. The carriage rattled on, leaving the wealthier part of the city behind, the grand houses giving way to narrower streets and dimmer lights. Alina did not tell the driver to turn back. Something in her wanted distance, wanted to be somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere she was not the Whitmore heiress whose engagement had just collapsed in public disgrace. By the time the carriage slowed near a row of modest buildings close to the docks, Alina had made a decision, though she could not yet have said what it truly meant. She was done being the woman who trusted too easily, who believed in promises whispered by men who did not deserve her devotion. Whatever came next, she would not let tonight define her as a victim. She stepped out of the carriage into the cool night air, the smell of salt and river water drifting from the nearby docks, the distant sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilling from a tavern down the street. She did not yet know that stepping through that tavern door would change the entire course of her life. But in that moment, all she felt was a fierce, burning need to prove to herself, and to everyone who would soon hear the story, that Alina Whitmore could not be broken. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked toward the light spilling from the tavern windows, unaware that inside, a quiet stranger sat alone at a corner table, a man whose life carried far more secrets than her own. The tavern was warm and loud, filled with the low hum of conversation, the clatter of tankards, and the occasional burst of laughter from a table near the fireplace. Alina had never set foot in a place like this before. The Whitmore family did not frequent establishments near the docks, and certainly not alone, and certainly not in a gown meant for an engagement party. She drew a few curious glances as she stepped inside, but she ignored them, choosing a small table near the back where the light was dim and the noise of the room offered a strange kind of comfort. A serving girl approached and set a cup of spiced wine in front of her without being asked, murmuring something about how Alina looked like she needed it. Alina did not argue. She wrapped her fingers around the warm cup and stared into it, trying to steady the storm still raging inside her chest. It was there in the corner of the tavern that she noticed him. A man sat alone at a table near the window, dressed simply in a worn coat and rough trousers, the kind of clothing common among the dockworkers who spent their days hauling crates from the ships that lined the harbor. He was not loud like the other men in the room, nor did he seem interested in the card games taking place nearby. He simply sat with a mug of ale in front of him, watching the door as if waiting for something, though nothing about his posture suggested urgency. Alina might have paid him no mind at all if not for the way he carried himself. There was something in his stillness, a kind of quiet control that stood out among the rowdy crowd, something that made her look twice. His jaw was strong, his dark hair slightly too long, and though his hands were calloused like a laborer's, they rested on the table with unusual grace. She caught herself staring and looked away, embarrassed, though when she glanced back a moment later, she found him watching her too, his expression unreadable. The wine did its work slowly, loosening the tight knot of anger and grief that had lodged itself in her chest since she had walked into that study and found Julian in Clara's arms. By her second cup, Alina's thoughts had turned dangerous, circling around a single, reckless idea that refused to leave her mind. She thought of Julian's smug face if her engagement simply dissolved into scandal and pity. She thought of the whispers that would follow her through every ballroom and dinner party for years to come. The poor Whitmore girl, jilted before her wedding, unable to keep a man's interest. She would not allow it. She would not become a story people told with pity in their voices. An idea began to take shape, wild and untamed, born from wounded pride and too much wine. If she married someone else quickly, publicly, before the scandal of Julian's betrayal could fully take hold, she would control the story herself. She would not be the woman who was left. She would be the woman who left first, who moved on so swiftly that Julian's betrayal became irrelevant, a footnote in a story about her own strength rather than her own weakness. It was reckless, it was absurd. And yet, sitting there with her heart still raw and bleeding, it felt like the only way to reclaim something that had been stolen from her that night. She looked again at the stranger by the window, and before she could talk herself out of it, she rose from her seat and crossed the room toward him. He looked up as she approached, his expression calm, though something flickered in his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or caution. "May I sit?" Alina asked, already pulling out the chair across from him. "You may do as you like," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying none of the roughness she might have expected from a man dressed as he was. "Though I imagine a woman like you does not often ask permission for anything." Alina almost smiled despite herself. "You would be surprised." "I doubt that," he said, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. "That gown was not made for a place like this. Neither, I think, was the look on your face when you walked through that door." "Is it that obvious?" "You looked like someone who had just lost a war she did not know she was fighting," he said simply. Alina studied him for a long moment, surprised by the accuracy of his words. "My name is Alina," she said finally. "Adrian," he replied, offering nothing more. No last name, no mention of family or trade, though Alina noted the absence and filed it away without comment. They talked for a while, though later Alina would struggle to remember exactly what was said, only that Adrian listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried a strange weight, as though every sentence had been carefully considered before it left his mouth. He did not ask prying questions about why a woman dressed for a grand party sat alone in a dockside tavern late at night. He simply let her talk, or not talk, as she wished. It was somewhere in the third cup of wine, with her judgment thoroughly clouded and her pride still smarting from the night's humiliation, that Alina said the words that would change everything. "Marry me," she said. Adrian's expression did not change, though something shifted behind his eyes. "I beg your pardon." "Marry me," Alina repeated, sitting up straighter as though saying it a second time might make it sound less insane. "Tonight or as soon as it can be arranged. I do not care how." "You do not know me," Adrian said slowly, watching her with an intensity that made Alina feel, for the first time that night, as though someone were truly seeing her. "I know enough," she said. "I know you are not the sort of man who would smile at me while planning to break my heart behind closed doors. That is more than I can say for the man I was supposed to marry tonight." Understanding flickered across his face, though he did not press her for details. "You wish to marry a stranger to spite another man." "I wish to marry a stranger because it is the only choice left to me that feels like mine," Alina said, her voice suddenly fierce. "Everyone in this city will hear by morning that Julian Ashford humiliated me. I will not let that be the only story they tell. Let them speak instead of the woman who did not wait around to be pitied, who took her future into her own hands the very same night." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not read. Alina half expected him to laugh, to dismiss her as a drunk, foolish woman chasing a bruised ego. Instead, he asked a single question. "What would I gain from this arrangement?" The question surprised her, though it should not have. She had not thought that far ahead, had not considered what a penniless dockworker might want from a marriage to a woman he had met only an hour earlier. "I have money," she said, "more than enough for both of us. Whatever life you live now, it could be different, easier." "I did not ask about money," Adrian said quietly, and something in his tone made Alina pause. "Then what?" she asked. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "I asked because I wanted to know if you understood what you were offering. Marriage is not a performance for an audience, Alina, even one built from anger and hurt." His words struck something in her, cutting through the fog of wine and wounded pride just enough for a flicker of doubt to surface. But the doubt was smaller than the storm still raging inside her, smaller than her desperate need to reclaim control over a night that had stripped it from her so completely. "I understand exactly what I am offering," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was not entirely certain they were true. "A chance for both of us." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that seemed to weigh far more than the situation warranted, as though he were considering something far larger than a stranger's reckless proposal in a dockside tavern. "You do not know anything about my life," he said finally. "You do not know where I come from, or why I sit alone in taverns at night, or what I might be hiding." "Neither do you know mine, beyond what you can guess from a torn engagement and too much wine," Alina replied. "Perhaps that makes us equally matched." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly Alina wondered if she had imagined it. "You are either the bravest woman I have met, or the most reckless." "Tonight I suspect it is both," Alina admitted. The tavern around them continued its noisy business. entirely unaware that a decision was forming at the small table by the window that would reshape two lives completely. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window, toward the dark street outside where the docks stretched into shadow, before returning to Alina's face. "If we do this," he said slowly, "you must understand there is no undoing it easily. Marriage is not a statement you can retract once the anger fades and the morning comes." "I am aware," Alina said, though her heart had begun to pound at the realization that he was actually considering it. "And you must accept that I will not explain myself simply because you ask," Adrian continued. "There are things about my life that are not yours to know, not yet, perhaps not for a long while." Alina hesitated only briefly before nodding. "As long as you do not lie to me." "I have had enough lies for one lifetime." "I do not lie," Adrian said, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made her believe him, though she could not have explained why. "I simply choose, at times, what truths to share and when." It was not quite a promise of honesty, but in her current state, wounded and reckless and desperate to reclaim some measure of control, it was enough. Alina extended her hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Adrian took it, his grip firm and warm, nothing like the careless touch she had grown used to from Julian. "Then we are agreed," Alina said. "We are agreed," Adrian echoed, though something in his eyes suggested he understood the weight of what they had just decided far better than she did. Neither of them could have known, sitting there in the dim light of a dockside tavern, that the quiet stranger across the table carried a secret far larger than either of them could imagine, one that would upend everything Alina believed about the reckless choice she had made that night. For now there was only the decision itself, made in anger and grief, and a desperate need to be the author of her own story. A decision that would carry them both toward a life neither had planned, bound together by a marriage born not of love, but of two broken pieces finding, however strangely, a place to fit. They left the tavern together as the night grew late, the city quiet around them, and somewhere behind them, unseen, the first threads of a much larger story began to weave themselves into place. Word of Alina's engagement to a stranger from the docks spread through the city faster than the story of Julian's betrayal ever could have on its own. By the time the sun rose over the Whitmore estate, servants were already whispering in the kitchens, and by mid-morning, Alina's own mother stood in the doorway of her bedroom, pale with disbelief, demanding to know if the rumors were true. "You cannot possibly mean to marry a man you met in a tavern," her mother said, pacing the room with her hands pressed to her temples. "A dockworker, Alina, a man with no name anyone recognizes, no family anyone has heard of, no fortune to speak of at all." "I do not need his fortune," Alina said calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she folded a shawl and placed it in an open trunk. "I have enough for us both." "This is madness born of a broken heart," her mother pressed. "Give it a week. Let the sting of Julian's betrayal fade and you will see reason." "I have never seen more clearly in my life," Alina replied, though even she was not entirely certain the words were true. Since waking that morning with a dull ache behind her eyes and the hazy memory of a stranger's steady hands, she had wondered more than once if she had made a terrible mistake. But pride, stubborn and unyielding, kept her from admitting it aloud, even to herself. Her Aunt Margaret arrived not long after, Clara trailing behind her with red-rimmed eyes and an expression of guilt she made no attempt to hide. Alina refused to look at her cousin directly, though she could feel Clara's gaze following her around the room. "Alina, please," Clara finally said, her voice small. "This is not the answer. Punishing yourself will not undo what happened." "I am not punishing myself," Alina said sharply, finally meeting her cousin's eyes. "I am choosing my own path, something I imagine you understand well, given how easily you chose to walk into Julian's arms." Clara flinched, and Margaret placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, though she said nothing in Clara's defense. Even Margaret seemed to understand there was little that could be said to soften the wound her daughter had caused. News of the sudden engagement reached Julian by early afternoon, and true to Alina's prediction, He arrived at the Whitmore estate within the hour, his face a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like relief, as though he believed Alina's reckless decision would somehow absolve him of his own betrayal. "This is absurd," he said, finding her in the garden where she sat attempting to steady her nerves before the evening's arrangements. "You do not even know this man's family name. For all anyone knows, he could be a criminal, a fortune hunter looking to attach himself to your money. And you were a man I trusted with my entire future, who spent 6 months sharing a bed with my cousin," Alina said, without looking up from the letter she was writing. "I think I will take my chances with the stranger." "You are only doing this to hurt me," Julian said, his voice rising. Alina finally looked up at him, and something in her calm, steady gaze made him take a step back. "Julian, I understand this is difficult for your pride to accept, but not everything I do is about you. I'm not marrying Adrian to hurt you. I am marrying him because, for the first time in months, I feel as though I am the one choosing my own future, rather than waiting quietly for someone else to decide it for me." Julian opened his mouth to argue further, but something in her expression stopped him. He left the garden without another word, though the anger simmering beneath his composure was unmistakable. The wedding itself, when it finally took place 3 days later, was a quiet, modest affair, nothing like the grand ceremony Alina had once envisioned with Julian. It was held in a small chapel at the edge of the city, attended only by a handful of Alina's closest family members, Edmund Price, and to Alina's surprise, a single guest on Adrian's side, an older man with kind eyes and a quiet, watchful manner who introduced himself simply as Henry. Alina wore a simple dress of pale blue, far removed from the elaborate gown she had chosen for her wedding to Julian, and yet standing at the front of the small chapel, watching Adrian approach in a borrowed but well-fitted coat, she felt a strange calm settle over her, entirely unlike the anxious excitement she remembered from planning her previous engagement. Adrian looked different in the daylight than he had in the dim tavern light, his features sharper, his bearing straighter, though Alina told herself it was simply a trick of the light and her own nerves. He took her hands as they stood before the small altar, and though neither of them spoke of love, there was something steady and grounding in his grip that eased the tremor in her fingers. "You do not have to go through with this," Adrian murmured quietly, so only she could hear. "There is still time to change your mind." "Are you trying to talk me out of marrying you?" Alina whispered back, a faint, disbelieving smile tugging at her lips despite the solemnity of the moment. "I am trying to make certain you are choosing this for yourself, and not simply as a reaction to someone else's cruelty," Adrian said. Alina considered his words for a long moment, the weight of the past 3 days pressing down on her, the whispers of the city, her mother's worried glances, Julian's wounded pride, Clara's silent guilt. Beneath all of it, however, was something else, a quiet curiosity about the man standing before her, a sense that despite everything reckless about the circumstances of their meeting, there was something genuine in the way he looked at her, something that had nothing to do with her fortune or her family name. "I am choosing this," she said finally, and meant it more than she had expected to. The ceremony was brief, the vows simple, and when Adrian slipped a plain silver band onto her finger, Alina felt none of the elaborate joy she had once imagined for her wedding day, but something quieter, steadier, a sense that she had reclaimed something for herself, even if she could not yet name exactly what that something was. Afterward, the small gathering moved to a modest dinner arranged by Edmund, who had taken it upon himself to ensure the day did not pass entirely without celebration, despite the family's disapproval. Alina's mother attended reluctantly, her expression carefully neutral throughout the meal, though she said little to Adrian beyond polite, distant pleasantries. Clara did not attend at all, and Alina found she did not particularly miss her absence. It was during this dinner that Alina first noticed something curious about her new husband. When Edmund, ever the careful lawyer, began discussing recent developments in maritime trade regulations, expecting little more than polite nodding from a dockworker, Adrian offered a response so precise and informed that Edmund paused mid-sentence, visibly surprised. "You are familiar with trade law?" Edmund asked, his tone carefully curious rather than suspicious. "A man who works the docks hears a great deal," Adrian replied smoothly, though Alina caught the flicker of something careful in his expression, a brief tightening around his eyes that suggested he had said more than he intended. The conversation moved on quickly, and Alina told herself it was nothing, that intelligent men could be found in every trade and station, that there was no reason to read deeper meaning into a single comment. And yet, as the evening wore on, she found herself watching Adrian more closely, noticing the way he held his fork with unconscious precision, the way his posture straightened whenever the conversation turned to matters of business or politics, the way his accent, when he was not consciously guarding it, occasionally slipped into something far more refined than the rough manner of speech common among the dockworkers she had passed in the streets near the tavern. She said nothing of her observations that night, too exhausted from the whirlwind of the past 3 days to examine them closely, but the seeds of curiosity had been planted, and they would not remain dormant for long. That night, as the small wedding dinner drew to a close and guests began to depart, Alina found herself alone with Adrian for the first time since their vows, standing in the modest rooms he called home near the docks, a space far removed from the grandeur of the Whitmore estate she had left behind. "This is smaller than what you are accustomed to," Adrian said, watching her take in the simple furnishings, the narrow bed, the single window overlooking the harbor. "I did not marry you for comfort," Alina said, though she could not entirely keep the uncertainty from her voice as she surveyed the modest space that would now be her home. "No," Adrian agreed quietly. "You married me for something else entirely, though I suspect neither of us fully understands what that something is yet." Alina looked at him then, standing in the dim light of the small room, and felt, for the first time since the disaster of her engagement party, a flicker of something other than anger or grief. It was not love, not yet, not even close, but it was something, a curiosity, a cautious openness to whatever strange path she had set them both upon. "Tell me one true thing about yourself," she said suddenly. "Not your family, not your past, if those things must remain secret for now. Just one true thing." Adrian considered the request for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. "I did not intend to fall for anyone tonight," he said finally. "And yet here we are." Alina's breath caught slightly at the quiet honesty in his words, though she quickly reminded herself not to read too much meaning into a single sentence spoken on a wedding night built from wounded pride and reckless choices. "That is a dangerous thing to admit to a woman you barely know," she said. "Perhaps," Adrian said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time that evening. "But you did ask for something true." They did not speak much more that night, both exhausted from the events of the past 3 days, but as Alina lay awake in the unfamiliar narrow bed, listening to the distant sounds of the harbor, the creak of ships against their moorings, the calls of night watchmen along the docks, she found herself thinking not of Julian, not of Clara, not even of her mother's disapproving silence at dinner, but of the quiet, careful way Adrian had spoken, and the strange, growing certainty that there was far more to the man she had married than either of them had yet revealed. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering through the thin curtains, and Alina woke to find Adrian already dressed, standing near the window with a folded letter in his hand, his expression troubled in a way she had not yet seen from him. He tucked the letter quickly into his coat when he noticed her stirring, offering a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Good morning," he said simply. Alina sat up, studying him carefully. What was that letter? "Nothing of concern," Adrian said, though the careful evenness of his tone told her otherwise. "Simply matters of work." Alina did not press further, though she noted, not for the first time, the careful walls Adrian kept around certain parts of his life, walls she had agreed, in a moment of reckless desperation, not to question too closely. But as she watched him move about the small room that morning, gathering his coat and preparing for another day at the docks, she could not shake the growing sense that the man she had married in a fit of wounded pride was far more than the simple dockworker he presented himself to be, and that the truth, whenever it finally surfaced, would change everything she thought she understood about the reckless choice she had made. The weeks that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Alina's life, one she had never imagined for herself in all her years growing up within the comfort of the Whitmore estate. Mornings began early, with the sound of gulls crying over the harbor and the distant clanging of ship bells, so different from the quiet, cushioned mornings she had known before, where servants moved softly through carpeted halls and breakfast appeared without a single thought given to its preparation. Here, in the narrow rooms near the docks, Alina found herself learning things she had never needed to know. She learned how to light a stove that smoked more often than it warmed, how to haggle with the fishmonger for a fair price on the evening meal, how to mend the hem of a dress herself rather than send it to a seamstress. Her hands, once soft and unused to labor, grew rougher, and though a part of her mourned the loss of her old, easy life, another part of her found unexpected pride in each small task mastered. Adrian left early each morning for the docks, returning in the evenings tired and sometimes bearing small bruises or calluses from the physical work, though he never complained. Alina found herself watching him more closely as the days passed, noting the quiet dignity with which he carried himself despite the demands of his labor, the patience he showed even when exhaustion clearly weighed on him. "You do not have to smile every evening," Alina said one night, several weeks into their marriage, as she set a simple meal of bread and stew on their small table. "I know the work is hard." "It is not so hard," Adrian said, though the faint stiffness in his shoulders as he sat suggested otherwise. "And there is little use in bringing weariness to the table when there are better things to discuss." Such as how your day went," Adrian said, watching her with genuine interest that Alina still found herself unused to. Julian had rarely asked about her days beyond polite formality, more interested in discussing his own affairs than in truly listening to hers. Adrian, by contrast, seemed to actually want to know, leaning forward slightly as she described the small disputes of the marketplace or the letters she had received from her mother, still cool and disapproving, though softening slightly with each passing week. It was these small moments, Alina realized, that had begun to shift something in her, moments of quiet attention and genuine curiosity that stood in stark contrast to the careless treatment she had grown accustomed to during her engagement to Julian. Adrian never raised his voice, never dismissed her opinions, never made her feel as though her thoughts were secondary to his own. He listened, truly listened, in a way that made Alina feel, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, that she was being seen as a person rather than simply an heiress to be won. And yet, even as her respect for him grew, so too did her curiosity about the parts of himself he kept carefully hidden. There were moments, small and fleeting, that continued to strike her as inconsistent with the simple life he claimed to lead. One evening, as they walked together along the harbor after dinner, they passed a group of well-dressed merchants discussing a recent shipment of imported silk, and Adrian, without seeming to think twice about it, corrected one of the men's calculations regarding the tariff rates with an ease that suggested deep familiarity with matters far beyond the concerns of an ordinary dockworker. The merchant, initially startled by the correction from a man dressed in simple laboring clothes, studied Adrian more closely before nodding slowly. "You are quite right," he admitted, though his expression remained puzzled. "Forgive me, but where did you learn such precise figures?" "A man picks up all manner of things, working near the ships," Adrian said easily, though Alina, watching closely, noticed the same careful tightness around his eyes she had seen once before, the look of a man choosing his words with deliberate caution. She said nothing as they continued their walk, but the moment lodged itself in her memory alongside the others, small threads that refused to weave neatly into the picture of the man Adrian claimed to be. Despite these lingering questions, Alina found herself growing genuinely fond of the quiet rhythms of their shared life. She began accompanying Adrian occasionally to the docks in the early mornings, watching the great ships unload their cargo, listening to the shouted calls of the dockworkers, the creak of ropes and pulleys, the endless motion of a world she had never before had reason to notice. She met some of Adrian's fellow workers, rough but good-natured men who treated her with a kind of easy respect she had rarely encountered among the polished circles of her old life. "Your husband is a good man," one of the older dockworkers, a weathered man named Samuel, told her one morning as she waited for Adrian to finish loading a shipment. "Quiet but sharp, watches everything, knows more than he lets on if you ask me." Alina's ears pricked at the comment. "What do you mean by that?" Samuel shrugged, adjusting the crate on his shoulder. "Just something in the way he carries himself, not like the rest of us. But he works hard, doesn't complain, treats everyone fair. That's all that matters to me." Alina turned the comment over in her mind for the rest of the day, adding it to the growing collection of small inconsistencies that continued to gather around her husband like shadows she could not quite bring into the light. Her relationship with her own family, meanwhile, continued its slow and uncertain thaw. Her mother visited occasionally, still clearly uncomfortable with the modest surroundings of her daughter's new life, though she had begun, grudgingly, to acknowledge that Alina seemed genuinely content, or at least far more settled than she had expected given the reckless circumstances of the marriage. "He treats you well?" her mother asked during one such visit, watching Adrian through the window as he repaired a loose shutter with quiet efficiency. "He does," Alina said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it entirely. "He is a mystery to me," her mother admitted. "A dockworker who speaks like he was raised in finer circles, who corrects merchants on tariff calculations, who carries himself like a man used to being obeyed rather than one who obeys others." Alina said nothing, though her mother's words echoed her own private observations far too closely for comfort. She had not shared her growing suspicions with anyone, not entirely certain what she believed herself, uncertain whether she was imagining significance in small, meaningless details simply because the alternative, that her husband was hiding something far larger than she could yet imagine, felt too enormous to fully consider. Word of her situation reached Julian as well, delivered no doubt through the same channels of gossip that carried news through every level of the city's society. He appeared unexpectedly one afternoon at the small market near the docks, finding Alina as she selected vegetables for the evening meal, his expression a careful mixture of concern and something that looked distinctly like satisfaction. "You look tired," he observed, his tone carrying false sympathy. "This life clearly does not suit you." "I am adjusting," Alina said coolly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "Adjusting," Julian repeated, a faint, condescending smile touching his lips. "Alina, you were raised for silk and servants, not for haggling over vegetables in a dockside market. This entire arrangement is beneath you." "What is beneath me, Julian, is a man who shares his bed with my own cousin while planning our wedding," Alina replied evenly. "I would rather haggle over vegetables for the rest of my life than spend another day pretending your betrayal did not happen." Julian's expression darkened slightly, though he recovered quickly, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. "I made a terrible mistake, Alina. I know that. But surely you cannot mean to throw away everything we built together over one error in judgment." 6 months is not a single error, Julian," Alina said, gathering her purchases and preparing to leave. "It was a choice, made repeatedly with full knowledge of what you stood to lose. I have made my own choice now, and I do not regret it." She left him standing in the market, his expression a mixture of frustration and wounded pride, and though the encounter left her hands trembling slightly, she found, walking back toward the small room she now shared with Adrian, that her anger toward Julian had begun to feel more distant, less immediate, as though the wound he had caused was finally beginning slowly to heal. That evening, she told Adrian about the encounter, watching his reaction carefully as she described Julian's attempt to win her sympathy. "Does it bother you," she asked, "that people in the city still whisper about the circumstances of our marriage, about Julian, about everything that happened that night?" "It bothers me that he caused you pain," Adrian said, his voice quiet but firm. "It does not bother me what people whisper. Whispers have no real power unless we choose to give it to them." Alina studied him for a long moment, struck again by the quiet wisdom in his words, wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the simple life he claimed to lead. "You speak as though you have experience with whispers and gossip yourself," she said carefully. Something flickered across Adrian's face, there and gone so quickly Alina almost missed it. "Everyone has experience with gossip in one form or another," he said, his tone carefully neutral, closing the conversation before it could venture any further into territory he clearly did not wish to explore. Alina let the matter drop, though the growing collection of small mysteries surrounding her husband continued to weigh on her thoughts long after the conversation had ended. She did not yet know what truth lay hidden beneath Adrian's careful composure, but she was beginning to understand, with growing certainty, that the truth, whenever it finally surfaced, would be far larger than she had ever anticipated on the reckless night she had proposed marriage to a stranger in a dockside tavern. The signet ring was the first true crack in the careful wall Adrian had built around himself, and Alina discovered it entirely by accident on an ordinary afternoon that began like any other. She had been searching for a spare button to repair one of Adrian's work shirts when her fingers brushed against a small wooden box tucked deep within the bottom drawer of the narrow dresser they shared, hidden beneath a folded stack of old letters. She should not have opened it. She knew that even as her fingers worked the small latch, some part of her aware that she was crossing a boundary Adrian had never explicitly forbidden, but had certainly never invited her to cross. Curiosity, however, had been building in her for weeks, fed by every small inconsistency she had gathered since their wedding night. And in that moment, alone in their quiet rooms with Adrian still at the docks, she could not resist. Inside the box lay a heavy gold ring, far too fine and far too valuable for a man who claimed to own nothing beyond his modest wages. Alina lifted it carefully, turning it in the afternoon light streaming through the window, and found herself staring at an intricate crest engraved into its surface, a design she did not recognize but which spoke unmistakably of noble lineage, the kind of symbol reserved for families whose names appeared in the society pages Alina had once read with idle interest before her own scandal had made her the subject of such pages instead. Beneath the ring, tucked at the bottom of the box, she found a folded letter, its paper fine and expensive, addressed in careful, elegant handwriting to someone referred to only as "my son." Alina's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, though a sharp pang of guilt kept her from reading beyond the first line, which spoke of a father's hope that his son might one day return home and reclaim what rightfully belonged to him. She folded the letter carefully, returned it to the box exactly as she had found it, and closed the drawer, her mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. A signet ring, a letter referencing a father's hope for his son's return and something rightfully belonging to him. These were not the possessions of a simple dockworker, whatever careful story Adrian had constructed around his life. When Adrian returned that evening, Alina studied him with new eyes, searching his familiar face for signs of the truth hidden beneath it, wondering how she had not seen it more clearly before. He noticed her scrutiny almost immediately, pausing in the doorway with the same careful stillness she had first noticed in the tavern the night they met. "Something troubles you," he observed. Alina considered lying, considered pretending nothing had changed, but the accumulated weight of weeks of small mysteries pressed too heavily against her patience. "I found the ring," she said simply. "And the letter?" Adrian's expression shifted, something like resignation passing briefly across his features before he composed himself once more. "You went through my things." "I was looking for a button," Alina said, though the excuse felt weak even as she spoke it. "I did not mean to pry, but Adrian, that is not the point. What point matters now is that you have been lying to me since the night we met." "I have not lied," Adrian said, his voice carefully measured. "I told you that first night that there were truths I would choose not to share, not yet. I never claimed to be something I am not." "You let me believe you were a simple dockworker," Alina said, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to remain calm. "You let my family believe it, let everyone who attended our wedding believe it. That is not honesty, Adrian. whatever careful words you use to justify it to yourself." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder as though weighing how much longer he could maintain the careful walls he had built. "It is complicated," he finally said. "Then uncomplicate it," Alina said. "Tell me the truth, all of it. I am your wife, Adrian, whatever the circumstances of how that came to be. I deserve to know who I actually married." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since their wedding night, Alina saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, a weariness that suggested the careful walls he had maintained for so long had begun, finally, to strain under their own weight. "Not tonight," he said quietly, though his tone carried none of the deflection it had before. "I promise you, Alina, the truth will come, but there are reasons for my caution that reach beyond simple stubbornness, reasons that involve people beyond just the two of us. Give me a little more time and I will explain everything." Alina wanted to press further, wanted to demand immediate answers, but something in his exhausted honesty stayed her tongue. "How much more time?" she asked instead. "Not long," Adrian said. "I promise you that much." She did not fully trust the promise, not after weeks of careful evasions and half-truths, but she recognized, too, the genuine strain in his expression, the sense that whatever secret he carried weighed on him far more heavily than she had previously understood. She let the matter rest, for the moment, though the uneasy silence between them that evening spoke louder than any argument might have. The following days brought little clarity, though the small inconsistencies that had once seemed isolated now began to arrange themselves into a clearer, if still incomplete, picture. Alina noticed Adrian receiving letters more frequently, each one prompting the same careful tension in his shoulders, the same brief disappearances to read them in private before tucking them away, unexplained. The true turning point came on a gray afternoon nearly a week later, when Alina accompanied Adrian to the docks to deliver his midday meal, a small routine that had become one of the quiet pleasures of their shared life. As they walked together along the busy harbor, weaving between crates and coiled ropes, a finely dressed older gentleman descending from a private carriage caught sight of Adrian and stopped abruptly, his expression shifting from polite disinterest to startled recognition. "My lord," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the busy dock, loud enough that several nearby workers paused in their labor to glance curiously toward the exchange. He bowed, actually bowed, with the kind of formal deference Alina had only ever seen offered to members of the nobility. Adrian's entire body went rigid, his expression tightening into something close to panic, an emotion Alina had never before seen cross his composed features. "You are mistaken," he said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "I am no lord." The older gentleman straightened, confusion crossing his face as he studied Adrian more closely, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by the denial. "Forgive me," he said slowly, though his tone carried lingering doubt. "You bear a remarkable resemblance to someone I once knew." He moved on quickly after that, climbing back into his carriage with a final, puzzled glance over his shoulder, but the damage had been done. Alina stood frozen on the busy dock, staring at her husband, whose face had gone pale despite his attempts to appear unaffected by the encounter. "My lord," she repeated slowly, the words heavy with implication. "Adrian, what is happening? Who was that man and why did he address you that way?" "A case of mistaken identity," Adrian said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the claim believable. "Do not lie to me again," Alina said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Not after everything I have already discovered on my own. That man bowed to you, Adrian. He called you a lord. That is not a simple mistake." Adrian glanced around at the busy dock, at the curious glances still lingering from nearby workers who had witnessed the strange exchange, and something in his expression finally cracked, the careful composure he had maintained for weeks giving way to something closer to genuine distress. "Not here," he said quietly. "Please, Alina, not here with half the docks watching. I will explain everything tonight, I swear it to you." Alina studied him for a long moment, torn between the urge to demand immediate answers and the recognition that whatever truth he carried was clearly far larger and more complicated than she had originally imagined, deserving perhaps of privacy rather than public exposure on a crowded dock. She nodded slowly, though her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "Tonight," she said, "all of it, Adrian, no more careful half-truths." He nodded, his jaw tight, and the walk home that evening passed in tense, uncomfortable silence, both of them aware that the fragile peace they had built over the past weeks was about to be tested by whatever truth Adrian had kept so carefully hidden. The hours until evening stretched impossibly long. Alina found herself unable to focus on any of her usual tasks, her mind racing through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Was Adrian truly a nobleman, living in disguise among the working class of the docks? And if so, why? What could possibly drive a man of noble birth to abandon his title and fortune for a life of hard labor and modest rooms near the harbor? She thought of the letter she had found, the reference to a father's hope for his son's return to something rightfully belonging to him. She thought of Samuel's comment weeks earlier, that Adrian carried himself like a man used to being obeyed rather than one who obeys others. She thought of his precise knowledge of trade law, his refined manner of speech when he forgot to guard it carefully, the fine craftsmanship of the ring hidden in their dresser drawer. Piece by piece, the picture had been forming for weeks, and now, finally, she stood on the edge of learning the full truth, uncertain whether she was prepared for what that truth might mean for the reckless marriage she had entered in a moment of wounded pride and desperate anger. When Adrian returned that evening, later than usual, his expression carried the weight of a man preparing to face something he had long avoided. He closed the door behind him carefully, as though the simple act required more effort than usual, and stood for a long moment in silence, gathering his thoughts before finally meeting Alina's waiting gaze. "You deserve the truth," he said quietly. "All of it, exactly as I should have given it to you from the very beginning." Alina said nothing, simply waited, her heart pounding as she watched her husband prepare, finally, to reveal the secret he had carried since the night they first met in a dockside tavern. A secret that would upend everything she believed about the reckless marriage that had, against every reasonable expectation, begun to grow into something she had not anticipated wanting to protect. Adrian drew a slow breath, his gaze steady on hers despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "My name is not simply Adrian," he began. "It is Adrian Blackwell Ashcombe. My father is the Earl of Ashcombe, and I am his only son, an heir to a title and fortune I walked away from nearly 2 years ago, for reasons I have never fully explained to anyone, not even the small number of people who know where I truly come from." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Alina had anticipated even after weeks of gathering suspicion. She sank slowly onto the edge of their narrow bed, her mind struggling to reconcile the quiet dockworker she had married with the image of a nobleman's heir, an earl's son who had somehow, impossibly, ended up sharing a tavern table with a heartbroken heiress on the worst night of her life. "Why," she finally managed to ask, "why would you walk away from all of that? From a title, a fortune, a life of comfort, to work on the docks and live in rooms barely large enough for the two of us?" Adrian's expression grew distant, shadowed by something that looked like old, unresolved pain. "That," he said quietly, "is a longer story, one that involves my father and choices he made that I could not forgive, at least not then. But I promise you, Alina, every word of it tonight." He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension still radiating from him, and began, finally, to tell her the truth he had carried hidden since the very first night they met. Adrian's story began 2 years earlier, in a grand estate far from the crowded streets and salty air of the docks, a place called Ashcombe Hall, set among rolling green hills nearly a full day's journey from the city. He described his childhood there with a strange mixture of fondness and bitterness, memories of a mother who had died when he was young, leaving him in the care of a father whose love for his son had always seemed secondary to his love for the family's expanding business interests. "My father built his fortune through the shipping trade," Adrian said, his voice steady but distant, as though recounting events that belonged to someone else's life rather than his own. For years, I believed it was an honest fortune, built through fair trade and sound business decisions. I was proud to be his heir, proud to imagine the day I would take his place managing the family's affairs. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly before he continued. That pride shattered nearly 2 years ago, when I discovered the truth about how a significant portion of that fortune had actually been built. Alina listened in silence, sensing the difficulty behind each careful word, understanding instinctively that this was not a story Adrian had shared often, perhaps not ever, with anyone beyond the small circle of people who already knew the truth of his identity. My father had been engaging in practices I could not forgive, Adrian continued. Underpaying and mistreating the very dockworkers who loaded and unloaded his ships, cutting corners on safety that led to accidents that cost men their lives, while my father concerned himself only with the delays such incidents caused to his shipping schedules. When I confronted him about it, demanding changes, he dismissed my concerns as the naive idealism of a young man who did not yet understand the realities of business. "What did you do?" Alina asked quietly. "I argued with him for months," Adrian said. "I tried to convince him to change his practices, to treat his workers with the basic dignity they deserved. He refused every time, more concerned with profit than with the well-being of the men whose labor built his fortune. Eventually, I realized that arguing accomplished nothing, that as long as I remained comfortable within the walls of Ashcombe Hall, benefiting from a fortune built partly on the suffering of others, I was complicit in the very practices I claimed to oppose." "So you left," Alina said, beginning to understand. "I left," Adrian confirmed. "I told my father I would not return, not as his heir, not as anything, until he agreed to reform the practices that had cost so many workers their safety and dignity. He believed, I think, that I would return within weeks, that the discomfort of ordinary labor would quickly humble me back into accepting his way of doing things. Instead, I took work on the very docks his ships used, determined to understand firsthand the conditions his workers endured, determined to prove that I could build a life through honest labor rather than inherited privilege." "And the ring, the letters?" Alina asked. "My father writes to me still, every few weeks," Adrian said, a note of weariness entering his voice. "Each letter asks me to return, promises vague considerations of reform that never seem to materialize into actual change. I keep the ring because, despite everything, it was my mother's before it was mine, one of the few things I have left that connects me to her memory rather than to my father's failures." Alina absorbed this information slowly, piecing together the picture of a man who had sacrificed comfort and privilege for principles she found herself admiring more with each passing detail. "The man on the docks today, who called you a lord." "An old associate of my father's," Adrian said. "I have managed, mostly, to avoid such encounters over the past 2 years, choosing docks and taverns far from the circles my father moves within. Today's meeting was simply unfortunate timing." Silence settled between them as Alina processed everything she had learned, the reckless stranger she had married in a moment of wounded pride revealing himself to be a man of far greater depth and conviction than she had ever imagined possible. "Why did you agree to marry me?" she finally asked. "That night in the tavern, you could have refused easily enough. Why accept a stranger's reckless proposal?" Adrian considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you looked at me the way people rarely look at dockworkers," he said. "Not with the careless disregard I had grown used to since leaving Ashcombe Hall, but as though I might actually matter, as though my thoughts and opinions carried genuine weight. I did not know, that first night, the full extent of what drew me to accept your proposal, but I know now that some part of me recognized something in you worth protecting, even before I fully understood what that meant." Alina felt something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest at his words, an emotion she was not yet ready to name, but which felt entirely different from the careless affection Julian had once offered her. "Your father," she said slowly, "does he know about our marriage?" "Not yet," Adrian admitted. Though I imagine, given the encounter on the docks today, word may reach him sooner than I would prefer." His prediction proved accurate within days. A letter arrived at their modest rooms less than a week later, its fine paper and elaborate seal standing out starkly against the simple correspondence that usually found its way to their door. Adrian's expression darkened as he read it, and when he finally looked up, Alina could see the news carried within was far more serious than she had anticipated. "My father is ill," Adrian said quietly. "Seriously ill, according to this letter from our family physician, a man I trust to be honest with me even when my father might prefer otherwise. The estate's affairs have fallen into disarray in my absence, and the physician fears my father may not recover without proper care and support." "What will you do?" Alina asked. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting emotions, the lingering anger toward his father's past failures warring against the genuine concern any son might feel upon learning of a parent's declining health. "I must go to him," he finally said. "Whatever remains unresolved between us, I cannot simply ignore his illness, especially if the estate and its workers now depend on someone stepping forward to manage affairs properly." "Then we will go," Alina said, surprising herself with the immediate certainty of her own response. Adrian looked at her carefully. "Alina, returning to Ashcombe Hall means returning to a world of titles and expectations, a world you left behind on the very night we met. It means my father will finally learn the truth about our marriage, and I cannot promise how he will react to learning his son married a woman of your standing under such unconventional circumstances." "I did not marry you for an easy path," Alina said. "I married you because, whatever reckless impulse first drove that decision, I have come to respect the man you have shown yourself to be over these past weeks. If your father needs you, and if his workers need someone to finally reform the practices you fought so hard against, then I will stand beside you as you do what needs to be done." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a mixture of gratitude and relief that suggested he had not fully expected such unwavering support. "Thank you," he said quietly, taking her hand in his. "I did not anticipate, when I accepted a stranger's reckless proposal that first night, that I would find in her such genuine strength." They departed for Ashcombe Hall 3 days later, the journey carrying them away from the familiar streets and salty air of the docks toward a world Alina had only ever glimpsed through the pages of society journals, a world of grand estates and inherited titles that now, impossibly, would become her own. The estate itself, when they finally arrived after a long day's journey, exceeded even Alina's expectations. A sprawling manor of gray stone surrounded by carefully manicured gardens and rolling green hills that stretched toward the horizon in every direction. Servants moved quickly to attend to their arrival, though their expressions carried unmistakable shock at the sight of Adrian, whom several clearly had not expected to see return after nearly 2 years away. They found the Earl of Ashcombe in his private study, considerably weakened from the illness that had confined him largely to his bed in recent weeks, though his eyes brightened with unmistakable relief at the sight of his son standing in the doorway. "You came," the Earl said, his voice weaker than Adrian had described but carrying genuine emotion nonetheless. "I did not truly believe you would. I came for the estate's sake, and for the sake of the workers who depend on it," Adrian said, though something in his tone suggested the reunion carried more complicated emotions than his careful words conveyed. "Not simply because you asked." The Earl's gaze shifted to Alina, curiosity and confusion crossing his weathered features. "And who is this?" "My wife," Adrian said simply. "Alina Whitmore of the shipping family in the city. We married several weeks ago." The Earl's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise, though something like cautious approval flickered across his expression as he studied Alina more closely. "A shipping family," he said slowly. "You always did have your mother's stubborn tendency toward the unexpected, even when it comes to matters of the heart." Alina stepped forward, offering a respectful nod despite her uncertainty about how to properly address a man whose title and standing so vastly exceeded her own experience with nobility. "My lord," she said carefully. "I am sorry to hear of your illness." "Kind words from a woman my son chose to marry without so much as a letter of introduction," the Earl said, though his tone carried more weary amusement than genuine offense. "I suppose I should not be surprised. Adrian has always preferred his own path to the ones laid out for him." The conversation that followed, stretching late into the evening, revealed the delicate complexity of the relationship between father and son. Years of accumulated resentment and disappointment, now forced into uneasy proximity by the demands of illness and inheritance. Adrian pressed his father repeatedly on the reforms he had long demanded: the safer working conditions, the fairer wages, the basic dignity owed to the men whose labor sustained the family's fortune. And to Alina's quiet surprise, the Earl, weakened by illness and perhaps genuinely humbled by the isolation of the past 2 years, agreed to consider changes he had once dismissed outright. "I am not the man I was 2 years ago," the Earl admitted quietly, near the end of their long conversation. "Illness has a way of clarifying priorities that stubborn pride once obscured. I have had a great deal of time, these past months, to consider the choices that drove my only son away from the home meant to be his birthright." Adrian said nothing immediately, though Alina, watching closely, saw something soften slightly in his expression, the beginning perhaps of a reconciliation neither father nor son had believed possible only weeks earlier. "We will discuss reforms in detail once you have rested," Adrian finally said. "But I am glad, father, to hear you speak this way, even if it comes later than I once hoped it would." As the evening drew to a close and servants showed them to the grand rooms that would now serve as their quarters within Ashcombe Hall, Alina found herself standing at a tall window overlooking the moonlit gardens, still struggling to fully absorb the transformation her life had undergone in the span of a single evening. She had married a penniless stranger in a moment of wounded pride, only to discover, weeks later, that the man she had married was heir to one of the most respected noble titles in the region, a man whose quiet conviction and moral courage had driven him to sacrifice comfort and privilege for principles he refused to abandon. Adrian joined her at the window, his expression thoughtful as he studied the same moonlit gardens that had once been the backdrop of his childhood. "This is a great deal to absorb, I imagine," he said quietly. "It is," Alina admitted, "though I find, strangely, that I am not afraid of it. Whatever comes next, I trust that we will face it honestly together." Adrian took her hand, his grip warm and steady, and for the first time since the disastrous night that had first set this entire reckless chain of events into motion, Alina felt something that resembled genuine hope for the future stretching out before them, a future neither of them had planned, but one that felt, increasingly, like exactly where she belonged. News that Adrian Blackwell Ashcombe had returned to claim his place as heir to the Earl of Ashcombe spread through the city with startling speed, carried by merchants and travelers who had witnessed the young lord's arrival at the family estate. Within days, the story reached every corner of society that had once whispered about Alina's scandalous marriage to a penniless dockworker, and the tone of those whispers shifted dramatically, curiosity and scorn transforming almost overnight into fascination and envy. Alina's mother was among the first to hear the news, arriving at Ashcombe Hall barely a week after Alina and Adrian's arrival, her expression a mixture of disbelief and barely contained excitement that Alina found almost as exhausting as her earlier disapproval had been. "A nobleman," her mother said, pacing the elegant drawing room where Alina now received visitors. "You married a nobleman, Alina, and you did not think to mention this rather significant detail." "I did not know myself, not until recently," Alina said, still adjusting to the strange reversal of her family's opinion regarding her hasty marriage. "And even if I had known, mother, it would not have changed my reasons for marrying him." Her mother did not seem entirely convinced, though the elegant surroundings of Ashcombe Hall clearly did much to soften whatever lingering doubts remained about the wisdom of her daughter's reckless decision. It was not long before Julian, too, learned the truth, and his response arrived swiftly in the form of an unexpected visit to Ashcombe Hall itself, a boldness that surprised even Alina, who had assumed her former fiancé's pride would prevent him from seeking her out again after their tense encounter in the marketplace weeks earlier. She found him waiting in the estate's grand entrance hall, dressed in his finest clothes, his expression carrying the same confident charm that had once won her heart, though Alina now viewed it with far more clarity than she had possessed during their engagement. "Julian," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "I did not expect to see you here." "I could not stay away once I heard the news," Julian said, stepping closer with an expression of practiced sincerity. "Alina, I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I hurt you in ways I can never fully undo. But surely, now that circumstances have changed so dramatically, we might reconsider what we once had together." Alina stared at him, genuine astonishment washing over her as the full implication of his words settled into place. "You are suggesting I leave my husband, a man who has shown me nothing but honesty and respect since the day I met him, to return to you, now that you have learned he holds a noble title." "That is not what I meant," Julian said quickly, though the flush creeping up his neck suggested her assessment had struck uncomfortably close to the truth. "It is exactly what you meant," Alina said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "You did not want me back when you believed I had married a penniless dockworker, Julian. You only reconsidered once you learned that dockworker was actually heir to an earldom. That tells me everything I need to know about the nature of your feelings, both then and now." Julian's expression hardened slightly, the charming mask slipping to reveal something more calculating beneath. "You cannot pretend the title means nothing to you either, Alina. Do not act as though you are above such considerations." "The title means nothing to me," Alina said firmly. "What matters to me is the man beneath it, a man who chose to live among ordinary workers rather than accept comfort built on their suffering, a man who fought for 2 years to reform his father's practices even at great personal cost. That is a man worth marrying, Julian, title or no title. You, on the other hand, are a man who betrayed me for 6 months and only sought forgiveness once you realized what you might be losing in material terms." Julian said nothing for a long moment, his expression cycling through several emotions before finally settling into something resembling resigned frustration. "You truly love him," he said finally, though it was more statement than question. Alina paused, genuinely considering the question for the first time, examining the feelings that had grown slowly over the past weeks, feelings she had not yet fully named even to herself. "I believe I am beginning to," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Whatever began as a reckless decision born of anger and wounded pride has grown into something I did not expect to find. Something built on genuine respect and honesty, rather than the careless affection you once offered me." Julian's shoulders slumped slightly, the last of his confident bearing finally giving way to genuine, if belated, understanding. "Then I suppose there is nothing more for me to say," he said quietly. "I wish you happiness, Alina, whatever you may think of my sincerity in saying so." He left Ashcombe Hall shortly after, and Alina watched his carriage disappear down the long drive with a sense of quiet closure she had not expected to feel, the last threads connecting her to the painful betrayal that had set this entire reckless chain of events into motion finally, fully severed. Adrian found her still standing in the entrance hall when he returned from a meeting with the estate's steward, his expression carrying quiet concern as he took in her thoughtful stillness. "I heard he came to see you," he said. "Are you well?" "I am," Alina said, and found to her own quiet satisfaction that she meant it entirely. "He came hoping I might reconsider our engagement, now that he has learned the truth about your title." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Alina said, meeting her husband's gaze steadily. "That whatever began as a reckless decision has grown into something I would not trade for any title or fortune Julian might now regret losing." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, warmth replacing the earlier tension. "I did not expect, on the night we met, that our arrangement would grow into anything beyond a convenient escape from difficult circumstances," he admitted. But I find myself increasingly grateful for whatever reckless impulse drove you to propose marriage to a stranger in a dockside tavern. As am I, Alina said softly. The following weeks brought their own challenges, as Adrian worked steadily alongside his recovering father to implement the reforms he had long demanded: improved wages and safer working conditions for the dockworkers whose labor sustained the family's fortune. Changes that met with resistance from some of the estate's more traditional advisors, but which Adrian pursued with the same quiet determination Alina had first noticed in him during their earliest days together. Alina, meanwhile, found her own place within the complicated world of Ashcombe Hall, learning to navigate the expectations of nobility while never entirely losing the practical resourcefulness she had developed during their weeks living among the ordinary residents near the docks. She used her own knowledge of the shipping trade, gained through years managing her family's business affairs, to help Adrian identify inefficiencies within the estate's operations that had gone unnoticed for years, contributions that earned her growing respect not only from Adrian himself, but from the estate's staff and advisors as well. The Earl's health, meanwhile, continued its slow but steady improvement, aided perhaps by the genuine reconciliation growing between himself and his son, a relationship rebuilding itself piece by piece through countless long conversations that gradually replaced years of accumulated resentment with something resembling mutual understanding and respect. "I misjudged you all those years ago," the Earl admitted to Alina one evening, as they sat together in the estate's grand library while Adrian attended to matters at the docks. "I assumed my son's insistence on marrying an unknown stranger reflected poor judgment born of rebellion against my own expectations. I see now that I was entirely wrong. Your son has a remarkable capacity for seeing worth in people that others might overlook," Alina said, thinking of the reckless night they had first met, the way Adrian had listened patiently to a heartbroken stranger's wild proposal rather than dismissing her outright. "He takes after his mother in that regard," the Earl said, a faint, wistful smile touching his weathered features. She, too, possessed a rare gift for recognizing genuine character beneath surface appearances. "I am glad to see that gift has found its way, finally, into a marriage worthy of it." As the weeks turned into months, Alina found herself settling more fully into her new role, not merely as the wife of a nobleman, but as a genuine partner in the important work Adrian had dedicated himself to, the ongoing reform of practices that had once caused so much suffering among the estate's workers. The reckless decision born of a single devastating night, the wounded pride that had driven her to propose marriage to a penniless stranger, had grown, against every reasonable expectation, into a partnership built on genuine respect, shared purpose, and a steadily deepening affection that neither of them had anticipated finding when their paths first crossed in a dim, noisy tavern near the docks. The renewal of vows took place nearly a year after the reckless night that had first brought Alina and Adrian together, held not in the small, quiet chapel where they had first married as near strangers, but in the grand gardens of Ashcombe Hall, surrounded by family and friends who had watched their unlikely union grow into something neither had anticipated when it began. Alina's mother sat in the front row, her earlier disapproval long since transformed into genuine pride, while Clara, who had reached out with quiet, sincere apologies in the months since their falling out, watched from a respectful distance, the beginning perhaps of a slow reconciliation between cousins who had once shared everything before betrayal had torn that closeness apart. The Earl of Ashcombe stood beside his son, fully recovered from the illness that had first brought Alina into his world, his expression carrying quiet pride as he watched Adrian prepare to renew vows with the woman who had, against every reasonable expectation, become exactly the partner he needed to help reshape the family's legacy into something worthy of genuine respect. Alina wore a gown far grander than the simple dress she had chosen for their first, hurried ceremony, though the elaborate silk and delicate lace mattered far less to her now than the steady warmth in Adrian's eyes as she approached him beneath an archway of white flowers. The same quiet strength she had first glimpsed in a dim tavern corner now fully revealed for everyone gathered to see. "A year ago," Adrian said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered guests as they stood together beneath the flowered archway, "I met a woman who proposed marriage to a stranger out of anger and wounded pride, never imagining that reckless decision would grow into the truest partnership I have ever known. Alina, you saw worth in me before you knew my name, before you understood anything about the life I had chosen or the family I came from. You chose me when I had nothing to offer beyond honesty, and that choice remains the greatest gift of my life." Alina felt tears gathering, not from sorrow but from the fullness of emotion that had grown steadily over the past year, transforming a reckless night's decision into a genuine, deeply rooted love. She had never expected to find again, after Julian's betrayal had once left her believing such trust might be forever beyond her reach. "A year ago, I believed I was choosing you simply to reclaim control over a night that had stripped it from me," Alina said, her own voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I did not yet understand that I was choosing something far greater, a partner whose integrity and quiet courage would teach me what genuine love actually looks like, patient, honest, and built on mutual respect rather than careless promises. I am grateful, every single day, for the man I found waiting in that tavern corner, and for everything we have built together since." The ceremony concluded with a celebration that stretched long into the evening, laughter and music filling the gardens of Ashcombe Hall in a way that Alina imagined the estate had not experienced in many years, perhaps not since Adrian's own mother had walked its halls. Dockworkers Adrian had once labored beside mingled comfortably with members of the region's nobility, a fitting symbol of the reforms Adrian had championed, breaking down barriers that had once divided the estate's workers from the family whose fortune depended entirely on their labor. Samuel, the weathered dockworker who had first observed Adrian's hidden depths months earlier, approached Alina during the celebration, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Told you he was more than he seemed," he said, gesturing toward Adrian, who stood nearby deep in conversation with his father, the two of them laughing together in a way that spoke to how thoroughly their relationship had healed over the past year. "You did indeed," Alina said, smiling as she watched her husband. The reckless stranger she had married in a moment of desperate anger now revealed as exactly the partner she had needed all along, though neither of them could have known it on that fateful night when their paths first crossed. As the celebration continued, and the sun began to set over the rolling hills surrounding Ashcombe Hall, Alina found a quiet moment alone with Adrian near the same fountain where they had first exchanged their vows earlier that day. The gardens had grown quiet, the distant sounds of music and laughter drifting softly on the evening breeze. "Do you regret it?" Adrian asked quietly, taking her hand as they stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "The reckless proposal, the tavern, all of it. If Julian had never betrayed you, we would never have found each other." Alina considered the question seriously, thinking back over the painful night that had once felt like the worst moment of her life, the humiliation and grief that had driven her to make such a desperate, reckless choice. "I cannot regret it," she finally said. "Every painful step of that night led me here, to you, to this life we have built together, to a partnership founded on honesty rather than careless promises. Julian's betrayal was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and yet it led directly to the best thing that ever happened to me as well. I have made my peace with that strange truth." Adrian pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture of quiet intimacy that had become familiar over their year together. "I am grateful, every day, that you walked into that tavern," he said softly. "Grateful that your reckless pride led you to a stranger's table rather than home to grieve alone. Whatever brought us together, I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that your reckless choice was the wisest decision you ever made." "I believe it already has been," Alina said, smiling as she looked up at the man who had once been a penniless stranger, now revealed as a nobleman of genuine integrity, a husband whose quiet strength and unwavering honesty had rebuilt her broken trust into something far stronger and more genuine than anything she had known before. Together, they watched the sun set fully over Ashcombe Hall, the estate's future secured not merely through inherited title and fortune, but through the genuine partnership between a woman who had refused to let betrayal define her, and a man who had sacrificed comfort for principle, only to find, in the most unexpected circumstances imaginable, a love built to last far beyond the reckless night that had first brought them together. 2 years after the renewal of their vows, a new challenge arrived at Ashcombe Hall, one that tested the partnership Alina and Adrian had built in ways neither of them had anticipated. A rival shipping magnate named Charles Whitfield, whose fortune had long depended on the very practices Adrian had worked to eliminate: low wages, dangerous conditions, and careless disregard for worker safety, grew increasingly threatened by the success of the Ashcombe estate's reformed operations. Word had spread through the shipping trade that Ashcombe vessels now employed the most skilled and loyal workers along the entire coast, workers who took genuine pride in their labor rather than laboring under fear and resentment, and Whitfield's own struggling fleet suffered by comparison. Whitfield began a quiet campaign to undermine Ashcombe's reputation, spreading rumors among merchants and trading partners that questioned the stability of a shipping operation run by a former dockworker turned nobleman, suggesting that Adrian's inexperience with proper business management would eventually lead the estate toward financial ruin. Worse, he began approaching Ashcombe's most skilled workers directly, offering higher wages in an attempt to lure away the very laborers whose expertise had become central to the estate's success, hoping to cripple the operation from within. Alina discovered the scheme first, her sharp business instincts, honed over years managing her family's own shipping interests, noticing unusual patterns in recent worker departures that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. She brought her concerns to Adrian one evening as they reviewed the estate's accounts together in his father's old study, now transformed into a shared workspace where husband and wife regularly collaborated on decisions affecting the estate's future. 3 of our most experienced dock foremen have resigned in the past month alone, Alina said, spreading several ledgers across the desk between them, each citing different personal reasons, yet each departure coincides suspiciously with increased activity from Whitfield's shipping company along our usual trade routes. Adrian studied the documents carefully, his expression growing troubled as the pattern became clear. "Whitfield has resented our success for months now," he said. "I had hoped he would simply improve his own practices rather than resort to undermining ours. Some men would rather tear down what others have built than do the harder work of building something better themselves," Alina said, echoing wisdom she had gained through painful experience with Julian's own selfish choices years earlier. "We cannot simply ignore this. If he continues poaching our best workers, the reforms we have fought so hard to establish could collapse entirely." Together, they devised a response that reflected everything their partnership had come to represent, not simply matching Whitfield's aggressive tactics with equally aggressive countermeasures, but strengthening the very foundation that had made their workers loyal in the first place. Adrian personally visited each department across the docks, listening directly to workers' concerns, and ensuring that wages and conditions remain not merely competitive but genuinely fair, while Alina used her own extensive knowledge of the shipping trade to identify new markets and trading partnerships that would secure the estate's financial future regardless of Whitfield's schemes. When Whitfield's representatives approached Ashcombe workers with offers of higher pay, they found, to their evident surprise, that most workers declined, citing not merely wages but the genuine respect and safety they had come to expect under Adrian's management, benefits that Whitfield's reputation for harsh treatment could never hope to match regardless of the salary offered. "You cannot buy loyalty that has been earned through years of honest treatment," Samuel told one of Whitfield's recruiters, who had approached him directly with a generous offer. "I have worked docks my whole life, under masters who cared nothing for the men beneath them. I will not trade fair treatment for a few extra coins in my pocket, not for any price." Word of the failed recruitment attempt spread quickly through the trade community, and rather than damaging Ashcombe's reputation as Whitfield had hoped, The incident instead highlighted the genuine strength of the reforms Adrian and Alina had built together, drawing new attention and respect from merchants and trading partners who recognized the wisdom of investing in operations built on genuine stability rather than the fragile foundations of fear and exploitation. Whitfield's schemes ultimately backfired entirely, his own reputation suffering as word spread of his underhanded tactics, while several of his own long-suffering workers, inspired by stories of Ashcombe's fair treatment, began quietly seeking employment at the very estate he had tried to undermine. Within months, Whitfield found himself forced to implement reforms of his own simply to remain competitive, a development that Adrian, despite everything, found himself viewing with quiet satisfaction rather than resentment. "Perhaps some good has come from his scheming after all," Adrian observed one evening, as he and Alina reviewed reports confirming Whitfield's own belated implementation of fairer wages and improved safety measures. If even a man as stubborn as Whitfield can be pushed toward reform through simple competitive necessity, perhaps genuine change is more achievable across the entire trade than I once believed possible. "That has always been your gift," Alina said, watching her husband with quiet pride. "Finding a path toward genuine improvement even in circumstances that might have driven a lesser man toward bitterness or retaliation." Their partnership continued to deepen through challenges large and small in the years that followed, each obstacle met not with the careless disregard Alina had once experienced during her engagement to Julian, but with the same honest collaboration that had first drawn her to trust the quiet stranger she had met in a dockside tavern. The Earl of Ashcombe, fully recovered and increasingly content to step back from daily management of the estate's affairs, watched his son and daughter-in-law build something he had never quite managed to achieve himself, a shipping empire founded equally on sound business practice and genuine moral principle. Alina's relationship with her own family continued its steady healing as well. Clara, whose quiet apologies had grown into genuine efforts at reconciliation over the years, eventually became a trusted friend once more, the old childhood bond between the cousins slowly rebuilding itself despite the painful betrayal that had once torn it apart. Alina found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer carried the sharp anger that had once defined her feelings toward Clara, replaced instead by a quieter, more mature understanding that people could grow beyond even their worst mistakes, given genuine effort and time. Julian, meanwhile, remained largely absent from Alina's life in the years that followed, occasional reports reaching her through mutual acquaintances that spoke of a man still searching, somewhat aimlessly, for the kind of genuine contentment that had always eluded him, chasing status and comfort without ever quite understanding the deeper values that made such things meaningful. Alina felt no lingering bitterness toward him, only a quiet, distant sympathy for a man who had never learned the lesson that had reshaped her own life so completely, that genuine worth could not be measured by title or fortune alone, but by the honesty and integrity a person brought to every relationship and choice. As the years passed, Ashcombe Hall became known throughout the region not merely for its noble lineage, but for the genuine fairness and prosperity that defined every aspect of its operations, a reputation built entirely on the foundation Alina and Adrian had established together in those early, uncertain months following their reckless marriage. Their story, once whispered about as a scandal born of wounded pride and desperate impulse, had transformed instead into a tale admired throughout the city, proof that genuine partnership, built on honesty and mutual respect, could grow from even the most unlikely and reckless of beginnings. Alina often found herself thinking back to that devastating night when she had discovered Julian's betrayal, the humiliation and grief that had driven her to the dockside tavern where her entire life had unexpectedly changed course. What had once felt like the worst moment of her existence had led her, through a winding and unpredictable path, to a life far richer and more genuine than anything she had once envisioned for herself. A life built not on the careless promises of a charming but shallow man, but on the steady, honest partnership of a nobleman who had chosen principle over privilege, and who had recognized from their very first meeting something worth protecting in a heartbroken stranger's desperate proposal. The penniless stranger she had married in a moment of reckless anger had revealed himself, in time, to be far more than the noble title he had once abandoned. A man whose true worth lay not in inherited fortune, but in the quiet integrity that had guided every choice he made, from his decision to walk away from privilege in protest of injustice, to his patient, honest partnership with a woman who had once believed she would never trust anyone again. Together, they had built a life and a legacy that honored the very principles that had first brought them together, proving that even the most reckless beginnings could grow into something enduring, genuine, and worth every difficult step of the journey that had led them there.